While history books love to focus on the knights and the battles of the First Crusade, the real power behind the recovery of Anatolia was a shadow envoy named Tacitus, a half-Saracen general of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos who did not use a sword to defeat the Latin warlords. He used logistical bottlenecks, negotiated surrenders in secret, and calculated psychological warfare to turn the world's most uncontrollable army into an instrument of imperial recovery. This is the story of how one oddly placed imperial operator, half-Saracen by origin and visually distinct, because of a prosthetic nose Anna Komnene describes in detail in the Alexiad, sat at the exact pivot where the First Crusade was either going to be a Frankish conquest or a Byzantine recovery. And the surviving record suggests he systematically engineered it to be the latter, despite every appearance to the contrary. We are going to walk through 5 parts of this story. The precarious position of Alexios I in 1096, the Golden Horn gamble where Tacitus extracted oaths of fealty from every major Latin leader, the Nicaea Baitan switch where the city fell to the Byzantines overnight while the Crusaders watched, the logistical mastery of the march inland that let Tacitus set the pace of the entire crusade, and the strategic vanishing act at Antioch that preserved the empire's long-term interests. When Pope Urban Roman II called the Council of Clermont in November 1095 and summoned Christendom to recover Jerusalem, the Byzantine Empire was in one of the most precarious positions of its long history, and the empire's weakness is the reason the shadow diplomacy was even possible in the first place. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had come to power in 1081 after a brutal civil war, and had spent the previous 15 years fighting a near-continuous struggle against the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia, against the Pechenegs and Cumans in the Balkans, and against Norman adventurers in the western Mediterranean. His armies were depleted, his treasury was strained, his provinces were emptied by decades of migration and warfare, and most of the Anatolian interior plateau was controlled by Turkish emirates that had been outside imperial reach for a generation, which meant the Byzantine heartland at that moment was reduced largely to Constantinople, to parts of Thrace and Macedonia, and to a foothold along the western Anatolian coast. When the first waves of Crusaders, including the famous People's Crusade led by Peter the Hermit, and the initial armed contingents under figures like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and others began arriving at Constantinople in late 1096 and early 1097, Alexios faced a difficult and unusually public calculus. On one hand, the Crusaders represented a manpower resource of unprecedented scale, with thousands of armed knights and tens of thousands of foot soldiers, families, and camp followers, whose numbers dwarfed anything the empire could field alone against the Seljuk Emirates of Anatolia. On the other hand, they were an unpredictable, fractious, and largely unsalaried force with their own internal leaders, who had their own political and territorial ambitions, and whose relationship to the empire ranged from indifference to outright hostility, depending on which Latin lord you were talking to and what their family history with Byzantium happened to be. A poorly handled Crusader army could as easily devastate Byzantine territory as it could march against the Turks. And the parallel threat was not hypothetical because the People's Crusade had already done significant collateral damage to the Balkans before being destroyed at the Battle of Sivtat. Modern Crusade scholarship, exemplified by the work of historians such as Jonathan Riley-Smith, Thomas Espridge, and Peter Frankopan, has long insisted that Alexios was not naive about the scale of this challenge and understood exactly what he had and what he did not, which is the more interesting context for understanding why his shadow envoy was embedded in the campaign from the start. His primary sources, particularly his daughter Anna Komnene's Alexiad and the Latin chronicles of the Crusade itself, portray a sophisticated operator who understood exactly what he had and what he did not, and the careful operational choreography of the first months of the campaign across the Bosphorus is hard to square with the simpler view that Alexios was improvising at every step. The first of our 5 main parts covers the Golden Horn gamble, the opening move in which Alexios compelled each of the major Latin Crusade leaders to take an oath of fealty to him before being ferried across the Bosphorus, and Tacitus was central to that process. The oaths were not a minor formality. They were the legal and political mechanism by which the crusade as a whole was going to be steered or not steered, and they required the Crusader leaders to acknowledge Alexios as their overlord for the duration of the campaign, to return any former Byzantine territory that they conquered, and to accept his strategic direction for at least the early phases of the operation. The exact wording and the precise obligations were negotiated one leader at a time, and the variation in how each leader received and interpreted the oath is itself a window into the politics of the campaign, because some leaders took the oath in good faith, others took it grudgingly, and at least one leader found creative ways to defer and to interpret the oath narrowly later in the march. Bohemond of Taranto in particular accepted terms that later became the foundation for a deep and lasting mutual interest between him and Alexios, and that mutual interest is part of the reason Tacticus's relationship with Bohemond became the most important bilateral channel of the entire campaign. Tacticus was, by origin, half Saracen, and Anna Komnene uses a Greek term describing a child of a mixed union that identifies him as the product of a Byzantine Saracen family background, which gave him an unusual combination of military competence, cultural fluency in Byzantine court practice, and a non-threatening presence to Byzantine authorities because his primary loyalty had already been tested in imperial service. Anna Komnene describes him in the Alexiad with striking specificity. His prosthetic nose, which he wore because he had lost a portion of his face to disease or injury earlier in his career, his military rank equivalent to a senior magister-level post, his role as imperial liaison to the Crusaders across the early phases of the campaign, and his presence at key moments including the crossing of the Bosphorus and the siege of Nicaea. The prosthetic nose in particular would have made him visually striking to the Crusader knights, who had no Greek or Byzantine context for such an injury, and may have interpreted it within their own familiar framework of violent disfigurement and divine combat, which is exactly the kind of physical distinctiveness that made him a memorable imperial presence in Latin accounts and that the chroniclers picked up on. Beyond the visual distinctness, what made Tacticus uniquely useful was his hybrid cultural background. As a half-Saracen who had been embedded in Byzantine service, he possessed an unusual combination of military competence, cultural fluency in Byzantine court practice, and non-threatening presence to Byzantine authorities, which made him the natural broker between the Latin and Greek worlds. He was, in effect, a translator and cultural broker figure for the Latins while remaining unambiguously loyal to Alexios, and Anna Komnene's framing of him in the Alexiad is positive but politically appropriate. While from a Western perspective, the same qualities that made him trusted by Alexios made him alien and slightly unsettling to the Latin lords who did not have a framework for understanding a half-Saracen Byzantine general with a prosthetic face. The second part of this story is the Nicaea-Baitan switch, the first major military test of the alliance, and the moment that established, for the rest of the campaign, the lasting relationship between the Crusaders and the Emperor, which was pragmatic, contested, and grounded in mutual self-interest rather than shared religious purpose. Nicaea was a major Seljuk-held city in western Anatolia, close enough to Constantinople that its reconquest was a precondition for any deeper Byzantine recovery in Anatolia, and the city controlled one of the key routes between the Bosphorus and the interior, so its return to imperial control was the first test of whether the alliance could actually work. The siege of Nicaea in May and June 1097 placed the Crusader army and a Byzantine force under Tacticus alongside them in a coordinated operation, and the siege lasted approximately 6 weeks, involved substantial investment in siege works, and is recorded in careful detail across both Greek and Latin primary sources. The narrative of what happened at Nicaea is one of the most extraordinary sequences in the entire First Crusade. Tacticus, who had been embedded with the Crusader army as their official liaison, was simultaneously engaged in secret communication with the Turkish garrison that held the city, and the details of those negotiations are described in Anna Komnene's Alexiad and corroborated, with somewhat different emphasis, in several Latin chronicles. The Turkish garrison commander of Nicaea and Kilij Arslan, as local representatives agreed to surrender the city to the Byzantines rather than to the Crusaders, and the deal was structured so that the Crusaders would see the city as effectively impregnable at the moment of surrender, and would not have an opportunity to take it for themselves in the heat of the campaign. When the agreement was concluded, Byzantine troops entered Nicaea overnight, occupying the walls and the major buildings in a clean, rapid sweep, and the Crusaders woke up to find imperial flags flying over the city they had been besieging, an outcome that was politically triumphant for Alexios, and politically humiliating for the Latin lords who had invested 6 weeks in a siege that ended with no trophies for them. They were, by the strict letter of their oaths to Alexios, bound to accept this outcome and not to treat it as a breach. And many Latin chroniclers record the precise forms of fury this provoked in the camp that morning, even though the campaign leaders in the end swallowed the result to keep the alliance functional. The psychological impact was enormous, and Bohemond in particular is described in Latin chronicles as visibly furious about the outcome, with Baldwin of Boulogne also reportedly objecting forcefully to the visible transfer of the city they had invested. The episode is almost universally cited in modern scholarship as the moment when the bilateral relationship between Crusaders and Byzantines took on its lasting character. Pragmatic, contested, and grounded in mutual self-interest rather than shared purpose, and that character persisted in various forms for the rest of the century. The strategic effect for the Byzantine Empire was substantial. Nicaea became the foundation of a recovered Western Anatolian frontier for the empire that lasted well into the following century. The Phrygian and Bithynian approaches to Constantinople were reconstituted under imperial authority, and the pattern of secret surrender plus visible allied presence, codified at Nicaea, would be revisited by Alexios in later episodes along the Crusade route, when the same leverage produced similar outcomes. The third part of this story is about the logistics of control, because once the campaign moved inland toward Dorylaeum and down toward Antioch, control of supply lines became the dominant lever in Tacticus's hands, and the lever he used most deliberately. Byzantine logistics in Anatolia were fragile in 1097, because after more than 2 decades of Turkish incursions and Byzantine reverses the road network, the marketplaces, and the warehousing infrastructure that the Crusader army depended on had been razed, depopulated, or absorbed into other political economies that did not provide for a passing Latin army. Anything the Crusaders needed beyond what they could carry with them, including food, feed for horses, replacement equipment, blacksmithing services, and in many cases even fresh water in arid stretches, had to come through what the Byzantines controlled or could negotiate on behalf of the army. Tacticus understood this with precision and used his position as imperial liaison to act as the gatekeeper of supply in the early stages of the march, accelerating or withholding resupply as the diplomatic situation required, accelerating or withholding advance guards, and accelerating or withholding intelligence about Turkish movements ahead. I Komnenos describes him orchestrating the early stages of the march from this logistical position, and the Latin chroniclers, especially Raymond of Aguilars and the anonymous Gesta Francorum, describe the relationship from the other side, often with suspicion and occasional hostile-sounding commentary about the Byzantine supply master. Bohemond of Taranto emerged in this period as Tacticus's most important interlocutor among the Latin lords, because Bohemond was the most politically sophisticated of the Latin leaders and had prior experience in Byzantine-Norman relations, having been part of the Norman invasions of Byzantine territory earlier in his career under his father Robert Guiscard. Bohemond had personal reasons to be deeply suspicious of the Byzantines and personal reasons to keep the alliance functional at the same time, and this tension shaped his interactions with Tacticus throughout the inland march in ways that the surviving sources reflect. Some modern historians have argued that Tacticus's relationship with Bohemond contained a kind of mutual respect that survives in the surviving records, while others see their interactions as a slow-motion contest of opposing interests. And the truth is probably somewhere between those two readings and depends heavily on which chronicler is being trusted at each moment. Environmental and hunger-based stressors became a tool in Tacticus's hands as the march continued, because as the army moved deeper into Anatolia, climatic conditions, scarce water, and the long distances between settlements made the army increasingly dependent on Byzantine logistics. The march through the arid stretches of central Anatolia in summer 1097, before the army reached the more populated areas near Iconium and Cilicia, became a defining period for the relationship between the Crusader army and the imperial supply chain, and the losses to disease, to thirst, and to Turkish raids during this period were substantial in the historical record. The survivors' gratitude toward and resentment of the Byzantine supply chain ran in equal measure, and the balance of those two emotions shifted almost weekly depending on the weather, the local population's willingness to support the march, and the immediate military situation ahead, which is the kind of pendulum that gave Tacticus room to operate without provoking a full Latin rupture. The fourth part of the story covers Tacticus's most striking recorded moment, his strategic vanishing act during the march toward Antioch, which is the point where the Greek and Latin sources most loudly disagree, and which is the part most worth examining for what it tells us about imperial strategy. Tacticus's most striking moment in the surviving record is his departure from the Crusader army during the march toward Antioch. And according to multiple Latin chronicles, Tacticus withdrew at or around the time the army reached the borders of Cilicia and began the approach to Syria. The explanations in the Latin sources are uniformly hostile. He is described as a coward who abandoned the army at its moment of greatest danger, as a betrayer who had been secretly working against the Latin interest all along, and as a trickster whose oaths to Alexios were never intended to be honored by the Latin lords he was nominally accompanying. I Komnenos' Alexiad provides the Byzantine-aligned reading, which is the more strategic and the more interesting of the two, and modern scholars have tended to read the departure as a calculated imperial maneuver rather than a sudden flight from danger. As the Crusader army moved further south, the strategic priorities of the empire shifted in measurable ways, because the Byzantines had a strong interest in maintaining control over the Mediterranean ports along the western coast of Anatolia, and in establishing footholds along the Syrian Mediterranean coast. These objectives could be advanced more reliably with a smaller naval and diplomatic force than with the Crusader army, and Tacticus's strategic retreat allowed him to redirect Byzantine military effort toward these coastal operations, while simultaneously distancing the empire from a contested siege at Antioch, where the outcome was already uncertain. The shared risk at Antioch was high, and the upside for the empire was contested, especially because Bohemond was on track to take personal control of any city they captured there. And the Alexandria's reading is that Alexios made a sharp trade by removing Tacticus from the front line of the campaign, and rerouting his skill set to coastal objectives that fit the empire's territorial recovery plan. The Latin descriptions of cowardice may themselves be a propaganda artifact from chroniclers writing after the fall of Antioch, when the relationship between the Crusaders and their former Byzantine allies was actively poisoned by Bohemond's later seizure of the city, and the establishment of the Latin Principality of Antioch under his rule. The geographic balance of post-Crusade Byzantium owes a great deal to operations on the western and southern Mediterranean coastlines during this period, because Smyrna, Ephesus, and parts of the Carian coast were recovered during the same broader campaign in which Tacticus was involved, and the Mediterranean ports of Syria and southern Anatolia, including the long-coveted city of Latakia and other targets, were contested between Byzantine and Latin forces for years afterward. Whatever the verdict on Tacticus's departure as a moral question, the end state transferred significant coastal and port territory to the empire, and left the Byzantines with a western Anatolian frontier that lasted well into the following century, which is the kind of outcome that imperial strategy can plausibly claim as a win, even when the openly debated part of the campaign went badly for the empire in popular memory. The fifth and final part of this story pulls back to look at the legacy of what Tacticus and the Shadow Empire achieved over the period of the First Crusade, and what the pattern of achievement tells us about how temporary coalitions can be steered by smaller powers with the right kind of leverage. The territorial recovery during and in the immediate aftermath of the First Crusade was, by any accounting, substantial. Western Anatolia, which had been outside imperial control for decades, was reconstituted under Byzantine authority in the years following 1097 through the combined effect of the Crusaders' passage and the empire's deliberate follow-on operations. Nicaea, Smyrna, Ephesus, and a swath of Bithynia, of Phrygia, and of the coastal regions of western Anatolia were recovered or held for the empire, and the strategic position of the empire after the campaign was transformed, in part because the manpower of the Crusader army had allowed the Byzantines to refocus and rebuild their own forces, and in part because the political landscape in Anatolia was reconstituted by the Crusaders' passage through it. None of this territorial recovery was a triumph of Byzantine military power in the open field sense, and none of it was a triumph of religious or ideological alignment with the Latin Crusaders, but it was a triumph of imperial maneuver, which is what made Alexios I one of the most underrated operators in Byzantine history. Tacticus's ultimate fate is uncertain in the surviving record, and that uncertainty is itself analytically interesting, because after his withdrawal from the Crusader army, the historical record of him becomes sparse, and he is no longer a major figure in surviving sources for the rest of the Crusade period. Komnenos' Alexiad, which is the most detailed source for his earlier career, does not give a definitive account of his later life and his eventual death. So the most that can be said with confidence is that his diplomatic military role during the early Crusade was a serious contribution to the empire's recovery, and that his disappearance from the surviving record is itself a measure of how effectively shadow diplomacy can erase its own footprint from history. Connecting the 11th century Byzantine pattern to modern proxy dynamics is necessarily a matter of analogy rather than direct comparison. But the structural lessons are striking, because a state with limited military resources relative to a much larger and more powerful movement can, under the right conditions, redirect that movement toward its own strategic purpose, extract territorial concessions, and emerge from the encounter as the largest net beneficiary. The tools that made this possible, including control of supply, control of passage, diplomatic engagement with the leaders of the movement, and division of spoils through pre-negotiated agreements with one's adversaries rather than with one's ostensible allies, are not specific to the 11th century and remain available to diplomatic operators in 2026 and have been used in similar configurations in more recent episodes of state-level maneuvering. The most durable lesson from the Tacticus episode is that visible spectacular events on the battlefield often tell less of the story than the quieter diplomatic operations running in parallel. Because the Crusader battles at Nicaea, Dorylaeum, Antioch, and Jerusalem command the popular imagination while the patient imperial maneuvering alongside them, of which Tacticus was a principal agent, recovered more tangible imperial territory than the heroic knight narrative ever quite accounts for. That disparity between the visible and the operationally important is itself the Shadow Empire's most enduring signature, and the reason that a half-Saracen general with a prosthetic nose deserves to be remembered as one of the most effective operators of his century, even though his name does not appear in any popular history of the Crusades. If this changed how you think about a story you thought you knew, the next video dives deep into the physics of what actually happens to your internal organs during high-G maneuvers, and why your body is not built to survive what your jet can do. So tap through and watch that one next.